So thank you very much for having me come and talk to you this afternoon. I'm going to take a slightly different bent on the whole telehealth, telemedicine approach, and we'll see what we can come up with that. So in particular, I'm going to talk about telehealth and how it might relate to exercise, because I'm a physio, so we like people to move around. And if you'd been next door, and I could potentially carry it over, we've been making everyone stand up and sit down multiple times in the day next door. So if you're feeling a little stuck in the shape of your seat and you'd like to stand up, feel free to go for it, because that will only tie in with what we're going to talk about here. So I'm going to start by telling you about what's been done in terms of telehealth in cystic fibrosis, in terms of what's in the literature of recent times. And bearing in mind, so this was a study that we did in Melbourne that was published, 3 years ago now. So again, there's probably been some new ones. But to that point in time, there were relatively few studies that had been using telehealth for people with CF. Most of them were only relatively small numbers, so 10, maybe 15 individuals, some up to 20, but mostly quite small numbers. And most often, telehealth was used to assess the feasibility of some kind of equipment. Could you measure your lung function at home and then send that information to your clinic? Could you record on a diary how you were feeling today and send that in? And across the board of the included studies that we had in this review, essentially people with CF and their carers were very happy to use the technology, quite interested in doing it, and were successful in using the technology. But I think there were two things that we took away from it. One was non-compliance with data transmission was quite variable and could be quite high. You'll see between 43 and 63% in the studies that were included with this. So I'm very keen to tap Denise on the shoulder later and say, hey, with your monitoring study, how good were people at actually remembering to send you the data at the point in time when you wanted it? And of course, because we had a particular interest in exercise and activity applications, certainly none of the included studies, or none of the studies that were out there in telehealth relative to people with CF, looked at anything to do with delivering interventions around exercise or physical activity. So why do we care? So this is where I start going off on a few tangents here. I'm not going to be telling you anything that you don't know when I report that the Australian Bureau of Statistics will tell us that more than 80% of Australian households have access to the internet, and certainly between more than 80% of individuals between the ages of 15 and 44 years have access to the internet on a daily basis. So this is our prime audience. This is who we're going after. So they've got the devices. Can we use them? I found this and I was torn between going, this is an awesome graphic slide and this is really, really scary. But this is from the UK and it gives an indication of smartphone penetration by age group, and it projected it from, this was published towards the end of 2013, so it was then giving projections for coming years. But as you can see here, one of the highest age group for smartphone penetration is the 18 to 24 year age group, but the 12 to 17 year olds are not far behind, and they supersede basically everybody in this room. So if we're wanting to get to our patients and we want them to do things, smartphone's probably the way to go. Why else might I care about getting people to do things via the internet when it comes to physio? Because let's not kid ourselves, everyone hates doing physio. This is some more graphics for you. So this is internet usage average per day. This is again Australian data by age group. So the 8 to 11 year olds are spending, let's say, half an hour or so on the internet. This is outside of homework time. But again, no one's surprised when I tell you that these 15 to 17 year olds are clocking 2 hours or more of internet time per day outside of homework. So this is where I need to get in so that I can get some of the things that I'm trying to encourage people to do to actually happen. I thought this was a really good picture until I realised that you probably can't see it very well. So the take-home message from this is the top two elements of the graphic. The very top one is looking at how consumers, so overall it's looking at how consumers spend their media time each month, and it's been the change. This was from 2015, 2015, so quite recent, looking at change in media time over the last 3 years. And the top one indicates how much time people spend watching live TV, and that has dropped by almost 3 hours a month over the last 3 years. But the second graphic up there is time spent using the internet, browsing the internet, and using apps on a smartphone, which has gone up by almost, wait for it, 10 hours a month over the last 3 years. So again, this is where I need to get into it, getting people to do things. So why might we need to combine technology and exercise? And if you'll bear with me for a moment, I am ultimately going to talk about a bit of Twitter action, but I'm going to take you on a little sidestep about why I think this could be an important place for us as physios, people trying to get people to be more active and do more things. So I'm sure most of you are aware exercise is important for people that have got CF. We know that if you're fitter, your prognosis is likely to be better. We know that with exercise, you get multi-system benefits. Your blood glucose control is better. You improve your bone health. You can, wait for it, I'm a physio, you can clear your airways better of all that lovely sputum. But it's okay because I'm not an airway clearance physio. I happily get people to run around, so we're good. We can move on now. The other thing, and this is relatively recent data, is starting to come out telling us that people that are more active in their day-to-day life that have CF have better health outcomes over time. So the lung function decline is slowed. The amount of time people spend in hospital tends to be less. These are activity recommendations for young people. I made the rash generalisation that a lot of people in this room would be parents, and so I apologise if I'm missing some of the demographic here. But activity recommendations for children between the ages of 15 and 17 years are aiming for a minimum of an hour a day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. That's running around, puffing, working up a bit of a sweat. But especially for the younger kids, needs to incorporate play and not just structured activity. But here's the catch. This is general population data that tells us that most of those kids are not doing that. This is data from the US, but again, as someone informed me yesterday, Australia has now taken out the gold medal position of the most overweight country in the world, so one would assume that this is fairly similar here. And across those adolescent years, at best, a third of these children are getting the required amounts of activity each day, and that tends to decline, especially in the girls as they get older, and there is quite the discrepancy between what the boys and the girls are doing. And we've seen this in our CF patients as well. This is data from a few years back now that was done here in Sydney, and it was looking at activity participation between young people with CF versus their healthy peers. And up to the age of puberty, the amount of activity people were doing was pretty much on a par. But after puberty, the amount of activity the children with CF were doing was dropping off substantially, and again, particularly more so in the girls rather than the boys. There is a point to this relating to telehealth, and I'm about to get to it. But before that, I'm going to tell you about adults and how much activity they do. And this is from data that we collected during my PhD in Melbourne, and we used activity monitors to get an objective measure of how much time people spent being active. And when we talk about this half an hour or so of activity each day that people are aiming for, we'd like it to be in chunks of at least 10 minutes so it can have an effect on your health. But you can see from this graph here that 3/4 of the time that these adult patients spent being active was in periods of time less than 10 minutes, so only a 1 or a 2 or a 3 minute burst. So again, even though people might be moving around, is it actually doing much to help their health? And this was the other key thing, is that, again, there's a discrepancy between our male and female patients in terms of who is actually achieving that 30-minute-a-day target. Our males, significantly more of our males did this than the female patients, with about 2/3 of the males getting this at least 30 minutes a day, and only just over 20% of the females. The average activity time for the male patients in our study, so we had 65 adults, half males, half females, and I realise 65 does not divide by 2, but it was pretty close. The average time of activity each day for our male patients was 44 minutes, and it was only 22 minutes for the females. So again, this discrepancy keeps going. So we need to be able to do more to help people be more active because we know it's beneficial for their health. But historically, in our world of physio and CF and trying to get people to be more active, we've only given people exercise programs to say, here, be more active, do this program. The problem is that exercise programs in and of themselves don't seem to be that effective at encouraging people to be more active in their day-to-day life. So they may do a bit of exercise for the period of time that the program exists for, but it doesn't seem to carry over. So why do we need to do something different? I'm getting back to the point here. In healthy populations, physical activity declines during transition stages. So that's when people hit adolescence. Yep, tick, we know that happens with our CF patients as well. Another key time of transition in healthy populations where activity participation drops off substantially is when people finish high school and move into that next phase, be that going to university, going into the workforce. And then there's another decline when people do take up full-time work. But the important thing is that this is a prime time for, especially that adolescence into adulthood transition, for developing the patterns of particularly physical activity, developing those habits that are going to take you forward through your adult life. So this is where we perhaps need to target something in terms of activity. There's reports of a high incidence of both anxiety and depression in people that have CF, and there is more and more evidence coming out now that relates how much physical activity people do to what their mental health is like. And so I think that this could be a really key area for us to help our working with our people with CF to help, if you like, even the score. We get to improve health outcomes because people are more active, and maybe we can make some of those outcomes relating to mental health look a bit more favourable as well. The other thing is everyone's time poor. We're all time poor, and we're asking our people with CF to do lots of therapy in addition to trying to maintain a full-time job or look after a family or maintain a social life and have relationships with people. I was talking to a girl recently who has a full-time job. She runs her own business. She is in her early 20s. She's a very social person, and she works really, really hard to be able to keep her lung function in the mid-60s. And we sat down and we did the numbers on it. And by the time, and she's also exceptionally compliant, so, you know, this may not be the best example, but by the time she's done her airway clearance and her nebs in the morning, and she goes to the gym every day, and she swims a couple of times a week, she's spending at least 3 hours a day just on her physio-related therapies just to keep herself healthy, okay? There's got to be alternative ways that we can work on trying to encourage people to do the things they need to do, but without it being a detriment to their lifestyle factors that they need to do as well. So this brings me back to the point I promised I'd get there. How can technology and exercise join forces? Well, one of those ways, and now we come back to the tele-type terms, is Tele Rehabilitation, which is a term which is defined as the provision of rehabilitation services from a distance. And it's not just monitoring, it means actually delivering an intervention. And so people may need to have some kind of equipment at home. It often involves an interaction using video conferencing. And most of the tele-rehabilitation work to date has been done in older patients that have got smoking-related lung disease in particular. And it tends to use virtual video conferencing like the method that Denise showed to you, but patients are set up in their home perhaps with a bike or with a treadmill whereby they will undertake their exercise under the direction of a physio. Sometimes they set up like a virtual exercise room whereby can have 3 or 4 people being monitored and exercising at the same time, and those individuals can actually speak to each other via the teleconferencing as well. And certainly in the older patients that did this, they got similar outcomes in terms of their health outcomes and their fitness as what you would see if we had convinced those people to come and visit us at the hospital as outpatients 2 or 3 times a week. So that was really good. And again, people adopted the use of the technology even if they wouldn't have described themselves as particularly internet savvy. So for us, we went, well, how do we apply this to our patients with CF? And again, this is still an area that's, I think, in its infancy, but we took the video conferencing software. We did use a slightly different one to Denise, even though we're in the same building, just a little ironic. And we went, how can we apply this to activity and exercise? So to start with, we went, well, can we use it to assess somebody? And so some of you may be familiar with or have seen people do a step test. It's a very basic test of what someone's exercise tolerance is like. But I'm sure you can appreciate, unlike asking someone to run up and down a hallway, a step test is confined, which means that we could set someone up with a step and a SATS monitor in front of the camera on a video. I was in a completely different building and we could conduct a step test and see how someone went. So what we did with this is that we had a group of, these were adults with CF who did 2 step tests for us. We did at least do it on 2 separate days so that they didn't complain too badly. And we did one of them where I stood next to them in person as we would normally run a step test, and then the other one where they had to log themselves into the software and we communicated via video conferencing. And we wanted to see whether could you be as effective as performing a step test when you were being monitored remotely as when someone was in the room? And the short answer was yes. People's performance was as good. We could monitor them. They were safe. The biggest complaint was that the metronome, which is used for the pacing with a step test, wasn't as clear when we did it with the teleconferencing system as when I was in the room. And that came down to I had the metronome with me and they were trying to listen to it via two different sets of speakers. And that's easy to overcome because you can just have a free downloadable metronome in the room with the patient. So the upshot of that was it can actually work. The patients quite liked it. Only one person said that she preferred doing the step test in person, and she said, and that's purely because I like to talk to you and I don't feel like we can have as good a conversation when I'm doing it via the computer. Another way that we may be able to integrate this technology aspect with getting people to be more active and do some exercise is using web portals. And again, this is I said before, all those studies that had been done in CF were small, so then I went and did another one of those small studies. And we had developed a website which used online tracking of activity and real-time feedback. So essentially what our participants did with this is that we needed them to log their activity for us, but in the bottom of the screen you can see some graphs. So as soon as you put in information about what you'd done in any given day, it repopulated the graphs and you could see how you'd been performing. There was the capacity for, there was an inbuilt messaging system, so people could message me and say, hey, the dog ate my sneakers, how can I possibly go running this week? And we could come up with some alternative strategies. We conducted some interviews with our participants at the end of this particular process, and overall they said, yep, it was great. But as you can imagine, all of these things cost money. So in its first incarnation, the website was built such that it was a web portal. It was best viewed on a laptop. You could, of course, pull it up on your iPhone or whatever other device you had, but it would be smaller and wouldn't look quite so sexy. So across the board, everyone said, we want it to be a mobile platform. Could it please be an app? And we have managed to make some changes, and hopefully very soon we'll be in a position where we can roll it out and try some more things. But some of the feedback that people gave us was that was around they liked that they were accountable to something, so they could see on a day-by-day basis what they were doing. They could relate that to how they were feeling when they suddenly go, I've actually been feeling rubbish for the last 3 days, and then they look at this and go, and the amount of activity I've done has dropped off substantially, but it actually dropped off for the 3 days before I started feeling rubbish, so maybe there's a sign there for me. Another thing that people particularly liked was that when they turned up to clinic and one of the physios in clinic says, so what have you been doing lately for your exercise? They could say, this is exactly what I've been doing. And so there was no ambiguity about what was going on, and there was no issues with perhaps people being believed or disbelieved, which they quite liked. As part of this particular trial, we gave people pedometers so that they had an additional means to be able to look at what they were doing and something to be able to record. And overwhelmingly, pedometers are not fashionable, and we would be much better served if we could find a different way for people to be able to gauge what they're doing. I haven't been given the wrap up yet, so I'll keep going. I think we're in a good environment to be able to potentially think of other ways that we could apply some of this technology to helping people move about and do more. Again, this particular information comes from general population studies, but what it says is that, particularly for school-age children, to encourage physical activity, so the strategies that work best at promoting activity tend to be school-based or community-based, in that it seems you need to have a core group around you and potentially some kind of social aspect to make these strategies be effective. Which I think begs the question for us is, can we create some kind of virtual environment that might create that same kind of community type spirit, for want of a better word, that might make some of these strategies around getting people to move more a bit more effective. But perhaps the next point I'll make doesn't have to be a bad thing. It just makes us realise that the people with CF that we've been trialling this with are no different to anybody else, and that in studies with, they were particularly middle-aged women actually, looking at using internet and social media to encourage physical activity participation. As the program goes on, reporting declines, so the amount that people interact with the program drops off. So perhaps we need to think about, if we're going to use these kinds of strategies for activity promotion, is there a key time to target? For example, if someone's on hospital in the home, or immediately after a discharge, or can someone self-select 2 times in a year where they particularly want to log in and have a 6 or 8 week period where they're utilising a program like this? I thought I would just touch briefly on other technologies that might relate to activity, which don't necessarily fit the telehealth model, but I figured someone would bring it up if I left it out. And so that revolves around gaming technologies. And I think that there's certainly a way that we could incorporate gaming technologies with the consultation factor in terms of encouraging and promoting activity, again, for, shall we call it, rehabilitation type purposes, or for people that, you could get a weekly consult with the physio into the home via video conferencing where you can actually see the activity that's being undertaken. And these kind of gaming technologies could be those. Caveat, I'm not standing here and saying, please go home and buy a Wii and have everyone use something, a Wii or a Wii Fit or a Connect or whatever they're all called, because they definitely have their place, but by the same token, I think outside and fresh air cannot be underestimated. And the studies that have been done looking in both children and adults suggest that the effort that's put in when using these gaming technologies can be equivalent to, say, a more traditional type of activity, be it cycling or treadmill or playing football or netball or something like that. But it tends to be accumulated in a different way. So there tends to be much shorter, intense bursts of activity. So the usefulness of the gaming technologies in being able to achieve those fitness and health outcomes perhaps depend on what your end goal is and so how effective they are. But I think they make a really good adjunct to activity, and I think they could be a really useful tool for us in terms of promotion and certainly mixing things up a little bit. And this is just a little bit more of the same, which I summarised. But particularly with gaming, we need to consider the duration and intensity of the activity. Is it useful for ongoing participation? Is there a catch with us promoting something that involves yet more screen time on top of what people have already got? And maybe that's the downfall of this kind of activity. Plus, would we, if we were being purists, really call this tele rehab, or is this just something else, which I can't think of just now? So, this is me summarising. Telehealth and exercise, is it coming to a home near you? I would like to think yes, but I think we need to work on exactly what it's going to look like, and it's probably going to look different for different people. There are some challenges that we would need to consider, not least of which is determining what would be the most effective in terms of that activity and exercise promotion, but what is it that people really want to do? If you're a person that only likes to be active outdoors in the fresh air under the sun, then someone like me saying to you, hey, do your exercise inside so we can watch it via the video, you're not going to enjoy and it's not going to work. So we need to be able to marry up those two things. We need to think about how much it costs, and in particular, who's going to incur the cost. Is it reasonable for us to expect that our patients will pay for their own data costs when they're talking to us if we're going to do an hour's exercise session, or should we be trying to offset that cost somehow? Never mind the provision of equipment if we're talking in terms of exercise, a bike, a treadmill if we're wanting to again have that virtual interaction. We need to drive our tele rehab models and our telehealth models based on, again, what our outcomes are rather than what the device is that is available to us, which again brings us probably back to cost and might be the thing that slows things up. And in particular, we need to be very clear about what we want to get out of it and make sure that what we as clinicians think we want out of it is actually the same as what our patients want, and determining what comes first and what comes second. I think that's all I've got. Thank you.